I've just started here as an assistant professor at the Department of Public and Applied Humanities. And one of the most exciting aspects of this work is the ways it allows me to explore how I can merge a scholarly interest in literature, especially those 900-page 19th century novels that we lovingly call in the business loose, baggy monsters, with an abiding interest in the urban that springs from a long career as a public school teacher in South LA. And some of this explains why I'm truly excited to be a part of this event. For me, the book was never an inert thing, but always that Alice in Wonderland looking glass or rabbit hole into all of the other magical places in my life. The classroom, of course, the city, and the stage. In fact, one of my earliest memories about storytelling is about its interruption. That sense of loss and estrangement when an adult came upon me one day while at play, breaking the spell of myself as prancing princess in front of a mirror, wearing my school skirt on my head as a wig. Somehow that sharp sense of being caught in the act taught me something about the state of imagination. Story, I learned then, is my homeland, and I, its fragile citizen. It is for this reason that I am thrilled to introduce the queen of storytelling herself, Little Miss Hot Mess, for her talk on sequence and stories, drag queens, and kids learning from each other. Little Miss Hot Mess has appeared on world-class stages like SF MoMA, San Francisco's first worker-owned bar, The Stud, Stanford University, and Saturday Night Live. Little Miss Hot Mess was among the first drag queen story hour storytellers and serves on its board of directors. She has hosted readings on PBS and HBO's Pride platform for organizations like the Kennedy Center, Brooklyn Museum, and the Institute for Contemporary Arts LA, and numerous libraries and schools coast to coast. She has published a children's book, The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, 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 which came out in 2020 and now only available as a back order on Bookshop because I just tried. And so get your orders in. And an upcoming one, if you're a drag queen and you know it, is coming out in May of 2022. Her writing has been published in The Guardian, Wired, Salon, and her work has been in media around the world. Oh, and in her day job, she is a new assistant professor in my department, the Public and Applied Humanities program at the University of Arizona. As a reminder for those watching live, if you have questions for Little Miss Hot Mess, please find the link on the Humanities Festival homepage. For those of you attending in person, please use the QR codes posted throughout the seating area to submit questions. As in deference to COVID safety, we will not be passing the microphone during the Q&A. Now please, join me in welcoming Little Miss Hot Mess.
Thank you all so much for being here. I am Little Miss Hot Mess, and this is my first time in a live studio audience since the beginning of the pandemic. So I am especially happy to be here in the flesh with you and to have everybody watching at home doing so as well. So thank you all again. Thank you to the College of the Humanities and the Tucson Humanities Festival for having me as part of this event. I'm so excited to talk to you all about my work with Drag Queen Story Hour and what we can learn from it if we read a little bit more in between the lines. So Drag Queen Story Hour, for anyone who is not familiar with it, is basically what it sounds like. It is drag queens, drag kings, drag performers of all kinds, reading books to children in libraries, in schools, and in community spaces around the country and around the world. And we have more than 50 chapters all around the world, including, these are some of our international chapters in Sweden, Tokyo, and Mexico City. We have 12 chapters in Mexico, which is very exciting. And this is one of those ideas that I think was just so crazy it might work. We were founded in 2015 by a group of authors and artists in San Francisco under the auspices of the Radar Productions organization. And so just to start off with a few acknowledgements, I just want to shout out our founders up here, Michelle T., Juli Delgado Lopera, and Virgie Tovar, who are all excellent, incredible queer artists in their own right. And I also want to shout out that it really does take a village to make a queen look this cheap, and to put this organization together, really. And so I just want to shout out our kind of global leadership team that helps Drag Queen Story Hour keep going. I am not a founder. I am just a loudmouth queen who likes to think a lot about what we can do with drag. So I also just want to shout out that I have published on Drag Queen Story Hour and research on drag pedagogy. And so I want to shout out my co-author, Dr. Harper Keenan, who is a professor of education at the University of British Columbia. And for anyone who's interested, you can find our article, Drag Pedagogy, the Playful Practice of Queer Imagination in Early Childhood. It is open access and online, so we are excited for everyone to be able to read it and learn from it. And I'll be drawing a fair amount of what I'm talking about here today, so I especially want to acknowledge Harper's contributions to this research. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit more later about the importance of family in drag communities, but I also just want to dedicate this talk, maybe kind of unusual, to one of my drag family members who passed away this year, Fatima Rood, who's one of the most creative, totally out there and also loving drag performers and humans that I've ever met. And so this is for her. So let's talk just a little bit about drag pedagogy before we get into some of the nuts and bolts. I kind of just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to talk about tonight. So when I talk about drag pedagogy, I don't just mean drag queens coming up and standing in front of a room of people and, spouting our crazy thoughts at you, but I'm really trying to think about what we can learn from programs like Drag Queen Story Hour and sort of what they do below the surface. Now, drag, as you might be able to tell, is an art form that is largely about surface. It's about the sparkles, the shimmer, the shine, but it's also often about reading in between the lines and sort of understanding what's going on below that surface. And so reading is a vernacular term within drag culture that is about kind of poking around, finding sometimes the flaws in other people, but also finding ways to interpret kind of broader elements of culture and give them a little bit of that queer twist. And so that's what I'm asking for you all to do with me today, is to think about how, if we read between the lines of Drag Queen Story Hour, if we, as much as I want a drag queen at the front of every classroom and in every library, if we also think about what we can all learn from drag performers, whether we are educators, whether we are college professors, whether we are librarians or parents, or just that cool auntie down the street, what we can learn from drag queens about how to educate children in our lives and educate ourselves. So let me just start off with a few of the kind of guiding questions that guide this research and will guide this presentation tonight. First, what kind of potentialities might the convergence of drag queens and children hold? As I mentioned before, this was one of those ideas that I think was just so crazy it might work. And I was almost surprised that it hadn't happened before, about 5 or 6 years ago. And in reality, it probably did. We're probably not the first queens to read stories to children or to perform for children. But as I'll talk about in a little bit, there's so many forces that are often trying to keep queer people, drag queens, children away from each other, right? And to keep those as sort of separate elements of culture and society. And so one of the exciting things about Drag Queen Story Hour is seeing this explosion of creativity that we find when we all converge, in the same room together, even if that's under some harsh fluorescent lighting and, at 9, 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Next, what might programs like Drag Queen Story Hour offer educators as a way of bringing queer ways of knowing and being into the education of young children. And here I like to let people know that, of course, we're not talking about making children queer. We're not even really talking about queerness as an identity. I'm talking about queerness as a politics about embracing difference, about celebrating whatever makes us unique and special and authentic, and of really standing up to the ways that we have always done things in the world, to sort of challenge those social norms and the status quo, which is another kind of important element of what drag does that I think a lot of people tend to forget about because we get so obsessed with gender and, and also the fabulosity. But at the end of the day, drag is really an art form that is about disrupting social norms, gender just being one of them. And then finally, what if we took play, defiance, and imagination seriously as forms of knowledge production? And this really kind of, comes out of thinking about the nature of what schools are, how schools are organized, and how there's been, an increasing move towards schools that are much more regimented, much more rule-oriented, much more test-oriented. And how can we, step back away from that and learn from drag as a form that is about play, that is about experimentation, that is about improvisation, and that is often about defiance, that is about being disruptive and standing up for what we believe in. And how can we kind of elevate some of those two important things that we all deserve to learn, right? Not just drag queens, not just us weirdos, but how can we all really activate our imaginations, 24/7, 365. So I want to give you just a couple of kind of definitions here as we get going into this, just to clarify a little bit further what I mean by some of these terms. And again, some of you may be coming in thinking like, what is drag? Drag is a boy dressing up like a girl, or a girl dressing up like a boy and putting on a show. And you're not wrong, but again, I think that's kind of like the 1.0 version of drag. And the 2.0 version of drag is really thinking about, again, what it's doing under the surface. And I think it's sort of aesthetic strategies that help us tell stories in different ways. So I like to define drag as a slippery term for a diverse range of highly stylized, queer and trans, gender fabulous performance practices, blah, 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 which often incorporate tactics of camp, appropriation, and the disruption of social norms. There's many other kind of aesthetics that we could think about across many different diverse terrains and experiences of drag, and I will walk you through a little bit of drag herstory that covers some of those interesting styles in a moment. But for now, I want us to at least get into this mindset of thinking about drag as really doing important cultural work. And I think that that's partly why it is such a lasting art form. It's something that, has kind of come and go and risen and fallen, in terms of its sort of mainstream appeal, and we're at a moment right now where it has incredible mainstream appeal, but drag has also been an art form that has survived, decades of homophobia, transphobia, racism, all sorts of social factors that have tried to push it underground and, to really denigrate this art form. So just want to put in that plug for drag as a folk art in many ways. And then secondly, I also just want to give a quick definition of pedagogy as my other key term here, which is simply a fancy way of talking about the art and craft of teaching, or the methods and styles by which we convey knowledge and learn from each other. And I think that last phrase there, learning from each other, is really key to my work here in thinking about drag pedagogy, which is how do we not think about learning as something that only happens in the classroom, in the library, but as something that we're all doing all the time, right? That we all learn from each other. We learn informally, we learn from our families, we learn from our friends, we learn from YouTube videos, we learn from all sorts of different sites. And how can we kind of, again, whether we're formal educators or not, integrate some of these techniques from drag into our everyday lives? So let me just give you a little bit more of a taste of Drag Queen Story Hour as an organization. As I mentioned, we were founded in 2015 in San Francisco and have since blossomed chapters all over the country and all over the world. And I wanted to share our mission and vision statements with you all, just to give you a little bit of a deeper sense of the way that we try to position the work that we're doing. So Drag Queen Story Hour celebrates reading through the glamorous art of drag. Our chapter network creates diverse, accessible, and culturally inclusive family programming where kids can express their authentic selves and become bright lights of change in their communities. And again, I think that those last sentiments are really, where I kind of hang my hat or hang my wig in terms of the impact of Drag Queen Story Hour, that like all forms of drag, we aren't just here for entertainment, but we're also not just here for education, or at least not in the traditional sense, where we really see our work as kind of fostering the next generation of global citizens, of people involved in the public humanities, of people who are trying to make the world a better place, a more socially just place, and who are willing to take a little bit of a risk to do that. Similarly, our vision, we envision a world where kids can learn from LGBTQ histories and experiences to love themselves, celebrate the fabulous diversity in their own communities, and stand up for what they believe in and each other. And again, that core sense of standing up for what you believe in, I think is such an important lesson that we often, kind of falls by the wayside in a lot of the education that happens in more conventional settings. So there is no kind of formal formula for Drag Queen Story Hour. Again, drag is an improvisational form, and part of our strength, I think, comes in our adaptability and in the ways that we tailor our programming in each of our locations. I always tell children that if you have 100 drag queens, you're going to have 100 uniquely creative, diverse individuals, and I think that our program really helps illustrate that. But there are some kind of typical ways that we go about doing it. Most Drag Queen Story Hour events feature 1, 2, 3 performers, often mostly drag queens, but also, as I mentioned, drag kings, other fabulous royalty. We read books and we sing songs, do arts and crafts projects. Some chapters do face painting. Some chapters host specialized readings like bilingual readings or readings for neurodivergent children. Some chapters have created programming for older children, including things like book clubs and sewing classes and makeup tutorials and those sorts of things as well. Central, I think, to our work and central to the theme of this Humanities Festival is storytelling. And we really rely heavily on the literature that is out there for children. And I will say that, as someone who stepped into this program without having many children in my life, it's been so exciting to both be reacquainted with a lot of the children's literature that I had growing up, and also to be, so pleasantly surprised by the incredible avalanche of much more diverse and much more socially engaged children's literature that has come out, especially even in just the past couple years, certainly like in the past 5 to 10 years. So I'm not going to talk about all the books, but I just kind of want to flash them at you because I know it can often be really helpful to get a sense of sort of what's out there. But in addition to my own book, there are other children's books about drag queens now, which is quite exciting. We often read books about LGBTQ themes, about anti-racism, about things like bodies are cool, but also, some sort of more general stories that help kids find their voice, help them tap into their unique creativity, and really help them understand that they matter. There's also a lot of books in our arsenal that are about different types of families, as well as books that are about kind of expressing your own inner sparkle on the outside. Mary Had a Little Glam is one of my favorites in that respect, teaching kids that you don't have to be a drag queen to be fabulous, right? That we can all express some fabulosity in ourselves. So I guess I already talked for a second about crafts and sing-alongs and those sorts of things. But as soon as this truck passes, what I'm going to do Nope, just kidding. First, I'm going to just also tell you that, as I mentioned, we are not the first people to bring children and drag queens together or youth and drag queens together. So I want to shout out that there are some other phenomenal programs around the country and around the world. This is an example called Queens of the Castro, based in San Francisco, that pairs older, elderly, senior, seasoned drag performers with high school students to learn the tricks of the trade and to put on shows as part of their high school experience. There's some more commercial projects like Nina West from RuPaul's Drag Race, who released her own children's album of music about drag for children. And there's also been a movement lately of what's called drag kids, which are kids who are performing drag in their own right. I think that's especially exploded in our past, few years, but even in this past pandemic year, I think having a lot of those virtual stages really opened up opportunities for children to have platforms to perform themselves, when they can't otherwise perform in 21 plus kinds of venues. And there's a great documentary called Drag Kids about some of these kids up there. Okay, but what I was gonna do was I wanna show you just a little bit of a clip of a short documentary about Drag Queen Story Hour called Tall Tales with True Queens. And this just gives you a little bit of that taste of what Drag Queen Story Hour looks and feels like. So we're just gonna watch a couple minutes of that.
I love being creative. I love exploring with makeup, hair, all this. It's a long process, but it definitely pays off.
There's something rebellious about being a cis man and getting dolled up, putting on a wig, walking in the streets and going to my gigs and taking over the space.
I think kids don't always know what to make of us. Things like gender are like the last thing on their mind.
They look like mermaids and queens. Are we done yet?
Hi, I'm Miss B. I am the drag queen for Drag Queen Story Hour this hour. Welcome!
When I first heard about it, I was just like, where can I sign up? And I was part of the first few girls who started Drag Queen Story Hour in New York City. So when I put on my wig on my dress, I'm ready to go save the world.
How many of you want to be a mermaid when you grow up? For me, I think Drag Queen Story Hour is just such a natural fit. It's like one of those ideas that's just so good that I'm shocked that no one had thought of it sooner.
So what do you think a drag queen is? A queen of dragons. We really are. We entertain, we lip sync, we are funny. We're like clowns, but prettier. And I get to hang out with people like you. Isn't that awesome?
Story time at a Brooklyn Public Library prompting a protest this morning. And it's who is reading to those children is what parents are upset about.
We have a drag queen, which is a man dressed as a woman, coming to read to children, not about Cat in the Hat, about gender fluidity.
I like to invite them in to see before they judge a Drag Queen Story Hour.
I love my wet shoes.
I think there's just something about us being larger than life, and that's really what they react to.
You get a lot of oohs, ahs, wows, and what's that?
To kids, I think, drag queens are princesses come to life or superheroes.
One of the kids said, a drag queen is someone who dresses fabulous, fancy. And I was like, oh, you're correct.
Kids, they're imaginative, they're all about play. They haven't been baked into, society's norms and expectations. So I think to them, things like being fluid with their identities comes really naturally.
They're setting a great example as being different, and there's nothing wrong with that.
All right, so I paused it there just in the interest of time, but I do think it's so helpful to hear from some of the voices of the children who get to experience this program and just even get those little snippets of the kinds of things that they are starting to take away. And hopefully that gives you all a little bit of a feel of what it's like to be in a Drag Queen Story Hour. And if anyone wants to attend, we will be doing a live virtual story hour this Saturday as part of the Tucson Humanities Festival in partnership with Bookman. So I will share a little bit more information about that after. But as we learned in that brief clip, Drag Queen Story Hour, as I've mentioned, we have taken the world by storm. We have been covered in every major newspaper and media outlet around the world, although we have also unfortunately faced a considerable amount of backlash. This headline that you see here on the right is just one of the most recent examples from the summer of a Drag Queen Story Hour event being shut down in Nebraska, unfortunately due to threats of violence. We've also had actions by city council members, by some now Congress people who shall not be named, by plenty of right-wing actors who are, see this as really kind of the new face of whatever tired culture wars they are trying to drag us back into. And we keep on going because we know that the work that we are doing is important. And if it wasn't so important, it wouldn't be striking this nerve. But I do also like to say that we're not really doing this to make a huge statement. We are doing this to celebrate a sense of play, a sense of imagination, and a sense of making the world just a little bit better for all of us in it. I also just wanted to say as well that, I do like to situate this talk. This is the moment of Debbie Downer in the talk. I do like to just mention that, we are living in this time where this increasing attention towards, especially transgender people and transgender youth, is of huge concern. We've seen numerous laws proposed around states around the country, including here in Arizona. We've seen the Supreme Court uphold discriminatory rulings against LGBT adoptions. We have even, seen sort of a growing rise of tying transphobic rhetoric to kind of authoritarian and fascist movements. And so I do think, again, as much as I'm not trying to have this be, the most political, I do think that our work does have important political importance in sort of countering some of these backlashed movements. And again, I don't think that that's just politics for the sake of politics. I also think that it really is something of a war on the imagination. It's a war on creativity. It's a war on self-determination. And so, the very threat of speaking your mind and showing up looking fabulously in a group of sequins or in an outfit of sequins can be too much for some of these forces that are really trying to impose, more of an authoritarian kind of worldview. Anyway, let's get back into a little bit of fun and talk a little bit about drag herstory. And I like to include this here just to give everyone in the audience a sense of many of the different aesthetics and styles of drag queens. This is going to be a really quick herstory, but just give you a little bit of the taste of that. And also, again, to kind of suggest that pedagogy is something that happens in all sorts of spaces. It's happened across all sorts of times. And it doesn't have to just be in formal settings. That drag also as an art form is really, it is about engaging with audiences. It is about teaching something, even if that is just putting a smile on someone's face or getting someone to think about something in just a slightly different way. That drag herstory really is a herstory of leadership of performers in our communities, kind of being the glue that binds in a lot of instances. So one interesting historical note, which has only, to my knowledge, kind of come to the fore in the past few years, is that the first person to identify with the term drag queen, or in this case, queen of drag, was a formerly enslaved individual named William Dorsey Swan, who hosted drag balls in the Washington, D.C. area following emancipation. And so I do think that, again, it's important to think about drag as this kind of liberatory, almost folk art practice that has been, centered and adjacent to many important movements and moments in political history. Jumping forward almost 100 years, this is how quick we're gonna go, I like to point out Jose Sarria, who was a San Francisco drag performer who was also one of the first LGBT people to run for public office in the United States. He ran for office about 10 or 15 years prior to Harvey Milk, one of the most famous LGBT politicians, but was also known for her work in the community, performing, but also kind of being this community leader who really rallied people's spirits during a time when homosexuality, transsexuality, cross-dressing were all criminalized. And so, we're going out to what we would now think of as a gay bar was a criminal activity where people were arrested for dancing with members of the same sex, for wearing inappropriately gendered clothing, quote unquote. And so Jose would take partygoers, basically parade them down to the police station after these raids had happened on bars and sing a parody song called God Save Thee, Nelly Queens, as a way to rally the spirits of those who had been taken into custody. So kind of this great camp performer as well as politician. He never actually won supervisor, but is sort of credited as showing that queer people could actually be an important voting bloc. We can look towards, pageant forms of drag. These are stills and promo photos from The Queen, a monumental documentary from the late 1960s, just before the Stonewall era, looking at the art form of drag that, clearly was quite profound and quite widespread in the country at the time. And on the left here, we have Flawless Sabrina, just like to name her as one of the matriarchs in this history. We can also look to figures like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Stormy DeLaveray, who were all instigators of the infamous Stonewall rebellions in New York City that sort of kicked off the LGBT movement as we know it now. And we're also, Johnson and Rivera identified as trans women, but also at various points in their life as drag performers, often used terms like street queen, which was part of the vernacular at the time. And DeLaveray was a drag king. So, I think it is important to think about how these pivotal moments in queer history, or pivotal figures in queer history, were also part of this extended drag family as well. We can look towards examples like the Cockettes in San Francisco, a group that's been around since the 1960s and 70s and has this kind of hippie, very crafty DIY style of drag. We can look towards groups like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, which sort of operate as something of a parody of the structures of the Catholic Church, although in that kind of campy way, also kind of do serve as a charitable organization. They raise money for community organizations. They provide safety at community events. So it is much more than just sort of a superficial facsimile. It really is kind of an engagement with what it means to be in service to one's community. We can also look towards more punk and club kid kind of aesthetics in drag culture. On the left here, we have Vaginal Cream Davis, a punk drag icon. And on the right, we have Lee Bowery, another icon of the club scene. We can also look towards the ballroom community, specifically Black and Latinx queer and trans community that isn't all about drag, but I think I would argue that drag is part of it through the tradition of hosting balls, competitions, where people kind of model and walk in categories. For anyone who's seen Paris is Burning or Pose, this is the community that's represented there. Of course, now we have the global ascent of Mother Rue, mainstreaming drag in every avenue that she can, and I will just leave it at that. But I think this moment of drag poses unique opportunities as well as challenges as we see what was once a sort of subcultural art form find its way into more mainstream spaces. I also realized I just want to give an extra special shout out to our drag kings, because most of my research personally focuses on drag queen performance, but of course there are many phenomenal drag kings out there who are often playing with aesthetics that both intersect with and transcend some of the kinds of camp aesthetics that I've talked about so far. And even in recent years, I've heard of performers calling themselves drag creatures, drag queens, drag things, drag monarchs. So there's a whole sort of explosion of ways of thinking about drag. And I do think it's important to also, as much as I was describing before, that drag is not just about sort of moving from one to another, that anyone, and this is something that we really believe in Drag Queen Story Hour, that anyone can do drag, no matter their identity before or after putting on their drag. And then I also like to point out the ways in which drag queens and drag performers have been involved directly in politics. A number have run for president and other political offices. This is Joan Jett Black, who ran for president on the Queer Nation ticket in the early 90s, sort of the era of ACT UP and the height of AIDS activism in the United States. And she ran as sort of a stunt, but also with a real platform that involved things like universal health care, returning indigenous lands to indigenous nations, and also renaming the Supreme Court to the Supremes Court, which I think we could all probably stand to think on that one a little bit. And then recently, queens have been voted into office. Here we have Honey Mahogany, another contestant from RuPaul's Drag Race, who is the first Black trans elected official in California, one of the first in the country, and maybe a girl who was elected to a neighborhood council position in Los Angeles. And there's several others around the country as well. And then just to kind of return to where I started with this point is that, again, drag pedagogy is something that is very familiar to drag communities, even outside of things like Story Hour. That I just like to highlight that learning happens backstage. It happens when performers teach each other to do their makeup, to lip sync, to create costumes, to style wigs, to organize fundraisers, to run for office, that there's all these sorts of ways in which we are all constantly teaching and learning from one another. So when I talk about drag pedagogy, I don't like to think of it as only something that happens through a program like Drag Queen Story Hour, but really as something that we can all be engaging in our daily lives. So let's, though, jump in the last little bit of this talk to think about some of the specific strategies that, again, educators, adults, creative people of all kinds can learn from drag performers as ways of kind of being in the world in different ways. And this is where my research with Dr. Harper Keenan really comes in. And we have laid out 5 different ways of that we think that drag pedagogy can take place. And so I'm just going to walk through each of these pretty briefly. So the first is to think about play as queer praxis. And I have the pleasure of teaching a course on play right now, and I believe some of my students are here, or maybe some are also online. And so in that class, we talked a lot about theories of play, histories of play, thinking about play is often theorized as something that's done for its own sake, as something that's done in its own kind of special time and place outside of everyday ordinary life in what is often called the magic circle. And so we have argued that creates this space for kind of queer learning, by really promoting play as something that is worthy of deep consideration, is worthy of deep investments in time in schools, and that it's something that really kind of can promote doing things for the sake of pleasure and not for the sake of productivity or profit. I also like to think about how drag is literally a kind of taking of one's imagination and displaying that out on the world. That another way of thinking about drag is taking your own inner fantasy and turning that into some version of reality. The root of the word imagination is literally about making an image of something, and that's what drag queens do, right? We create an image, we step out into the world, and not only are ourselves changed, but the world around us changes, even if only just for that moment. Number 2, serving looks and aesthetic transformations. This is where we talk about how drag does something even if we don't read a book, right? That a drag queen walking into a library, walking into this classroom, hopefully me standing here before you today, shining and glittering, teaches you something. It helps transform the space It helps create a new relationship between those of us in the room. And it opens up a space for curiosity and inquiry that really kind of eases its way into the unusual. And so we're not suggesting that teachers show up to their everyday classrooms in drag necessarily, but that we can think about ways that even just subtle forms of changing the environment, changing our appearance, letting our sillies out, these sorts of things are effective strategies for kind of taking away some of that anxiety, that stress, that hierarchy in the classroom, and again, returning to that sense of pleasure and joy. Drag has this, one way of thinking about drag that has been said by RuPaul, also by the gay liberation activist Teddy Matthews, is that we're all born naked and the rest is drag. And so drag kind of historically has been this vernacular term that can be about the kind of drag that you see here before you today, but can also be a way of kind of acknowledging that we all perform certain aspects of ourselves through the ways that we dress and present ourselves to the world. So you might talk about your professor drag or your teacher drag or your librarian drag or your 9-to-5 drag or all these different forms of drag that we all kind of put on and take off depending on what the situation calls for. And so thinking a little bit more consciously about how we step out into the world is part of this sense of serving a look. Next, this is one of my favorites, and this is thinking about inviting strategic defiance from children and from our communities. This really taps into the improvisatory and kind of often, frankly, unruly nature of drag performance and the parallels with a lot of working with children. I always joke that, basically dealing with a drunk heckler at 11 p.m. at a gay bar is really not all that different from dealing with like a sugar hide 5-year-old at 11 a.m. at a library. And so I think that teachers can learn something from, and that we can all learn something from drag performers and how they handle those tough situations where someone heckles you or someone talks back. The traditional kind of mode in education is to really kind of lean into classroom management and to really kind of lay down the law and assert the rules. And so part of what we're asking here is what happens if we peel that back away a little bit? What happens if we invite a little bit of that uncertainty into the room? How can we bring those children who might seem disruptive back into the conversation in a way that creates a sense of solidarity with them rather than sort of shaming them for their behavior? And how often, or in what cases do we actually want to teach children to question authority and ask why? Many of us have probably sat with a kid who has asked why and why and why and why, and we've just wanted to bang our head against the wall. But that is a curiosity that I think we do want to find ways to cultivate. And we want to find ways to cultivate that tie that into, some of this sort of war on imagination that I've been talking about, that encourage children to not just ask why, but to ask why things have always been done a certain way, to ask who said so, to ask, why do I have to listen to that if that really challenges my own beliefs or my own sense in the world, of being in the world. Fourth is to actively engage strategies of camp as ways of destigmatizing shame. So how can we use humor strategically in our classrooms, in our practices, as ways to address difficult topics? This is another thing that drag performance has done so well over the years, is to be able to take on these real moments of trauma often in our communities and to be able to laugh at them, to be able to wink at them, to be able to sort of take them in stride. Camp is one of those concepts that's like a little bit too deep to get into, but it's kind of one of those things that you know it when you see it. But it is a way of sort of describing a way of turning everything into an aesthetic question, a way of kind of turning everything into a little kind of off-the-shoulder joke. But many theorists of camp also note that it is something that is also taken very seriously, that you can't camp about something that you don't care about, and that camp is often understood as the lie that tells the truth. It's a way of sometimes finding the kernel of truth in something that feels fictitious, but that actually reveals something deeper. And so in that way as well, now I remember what I was going to say. I was also going to just mention too that part of writing my own book here, The Hips on the Drag Queen Go Swish, 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 for me was about engaging that sense of camp collectively with children, of taking some of these gestures and behaviors that I was teased for or that I was policed out of as a child, such as swishing my hips or being too feminine. And creating spaces for children of all genders to explore these types of activities, these types of behaviors in a safe way. So I was just going to show you a couple clips that parents have shared with me and given me permission to share of their children engaging, just singing a couple of the verses of the book, partly because, again, I think it's always important to see children having fun. So.
Cheeks on your blush, blush. Blush, 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 blush. Cheeks blush, blush, blush. Author, a town.
Here's one more.
On the drag queen go snap, snap, snap.
Snap, snap, snap. Snap, snap, snap.
The fingers on the drag queen go
Snap, snap, snap.
all through the town.
And just one last quick one.
Shimmy, 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 shimmy. Shimmy, shimmy, shimmy. The shit on the drag queen go. Shimmy, shimmy, shimmy.
A little early. But I mean, not only how cute are those kids, but who of us ever thought that we would see a group of siblings shimmying their shoulders like drag queens reading along with a children's book, right? And so that is some of the joy that this brings for me, is getting to see these spaces where kids can really explore these elements, these experiences in ways that many of us weren't able to as children. The one other quick thing that I also like to say about camp is that camp is itself deeply a process of reading and interpretation, in that way that I said that you can't, be campy about something that you don't take seriously. You also can't be campy about something that you don't know anything about. Camp is inherently about kind of getting under the hood of something, understanding it so that you can make a joke about it, so that you can recontextualize it, so that you can kind of spin it around and turn it into something else. And then finally, the last way in which I like to think about how drag pedagogy might be mobilized in many aspects of our lives is to think about moving beyond a sense of empathy towards what I describe as embodied kinship. And there's a lot of interesting, empathy can be a great concept. It does, it's language that I use sometimes when I write grants for Drag Queen Story Hour or justify it to skeptical audiences. But there's also a lot of interesting feminist, especially feminists of color research that critiques ideas of empathy as sort of appropriating others' experiences, of further marginalizing people, by trying to sort of occupy the position of the other. And so one thing that helped me think about is how drag isn't fundamentally about impersonation. It's not about walking in someone else's shoes. It's really about trying on different pairs of shoes and seeing how they fit, and seeing how when you step out into the world in those pairs of shoes, something about you changes, and again, something about the world changes around you. So it really is a process of sort of exploring different elements of yourself and letting those bubble up and getting to experiment with those. The other thing that I mentioned at the beginning is that there are long traditions of chosen families in drag culture, of drag families. Often your drag mother is the person who first paints your face or first puts you in drag. With Halloween coming up, that's like the prime time for people to start adopting drag children. But drag families are another one of those kind of camp creations where they might seem kind of, fun and frivolous, but also actually hold a lot of social and cultural weight. Drag families sometimes live together, eat together, take care of each other, visit each other when they're sick, lend each other money, pay their tuition, all these sorts of things. And so I think that, that's another thing that children and that we can all learn from drag performers is about how to create these new relationships that again, aren't sort of based on normative family structures. And that's the kind of, living queerly, bringing the queerness into the space of the classroom, bringing queerness out into the world that I opened this talk with. So finally, I'm just about to wrap up. I'm a couple minutes over, but I also just wanted to share kind of a brief coda of thinking about, I've talked a lot about what children can learn from drag queens, what educators can learn from drag queens. But I also just want to reflect briefly on what I have learned as a drag queen from doing this work. And much of that is really about how to sort of get in touch with my own inner childhood, how to get in touch with children's literature, how to play in ways that are conscious and joyful and creative. It's also, I would say, been a very healing experience for me to be able to provide these opportunities for children that I never had, to see children shimmying their shoulders, to see kids dressing up in drag or dressing up in ways that affirm their gender identities, and looking fabulous at a library. And I've also learned a lot just from talking to children and hearing their questions, understanding the ways they think about the world, understanding their senses of humor and how that might differ from the humor of adults at a gay bar late at night who are all drunk. And that opens up new possibilities for me as a performer and also as an educator. The one other thing that I'll just say as well is that, and something I've been reflecting on as I've been creating this presentation while teaching this class on play, is that it's even for me in all this fabulousness, it's very difficult to walk this talk sometimes, to put some of these practices into practice when I don't have my armor on. And so finding those ways to keep incorporating play, to keep incorporating creativity into my own life is something that I feel like I am still learning as well. So thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it.